Okay, so in lieu of having an actual face-to-face class today, I thought I'd do a little screencast to keep us up to date and not too much further behind. So here we go. So we've already spent some time talking about firms' profitability and costs, and we're going to locate ourselves in the first type of firm that we're looking at, and that's sort of very competitive firms. Remember that not all firms are competitive. In fact, we're going to make the assertion that most firms are probably not the style that we're talking about today. But it's useful to locate ourselves sort of in the ideal Adam Smith vision of what if capitalism were dominated by a bunch of very small competitive firms. That's when capitalism, as you remember, works the best. When we have a lot of individual firms competing against each other for your and my business, and it ends up serving society a little better because they're fighting to get your business by lowering prices, improving quality, etc. So that's the type of firm we're looking at today. We're going to make a couple of assumptions here, or assertions rather. First of all, that competitive industries that have a lot of small individual, small-sized firms, are going to end up being pretty great because they reduce total industry cost of production. In other words, they're pretty efficient. And the balance of industries, what we find is that sort of naturally the business gets funneled towards the lower cost industries. So it's a way of dividing and awarding the business to those that who would do a better job with the business. In other words, who have lower costs, who have more efficient methods of production. And then we'll talk about sort of long-term, what if profits develop, what can we expect, how do these types of firms that are so competitive end up making money in the long run. And we talk about that, basically the efficiency and how great these very competitive markets are, at least through the lens of society at large and especially consumers. So something we've already learned is that for firms to maximize profit, they need to produce at the quantity where marginal revenue crosses marginal cost. Now, for firms that are very competitive, the marginal revenue ends up being the same as price. So the price equals marginal cost is the condition for profit maximization for perfectly competitive firms. Now, as it turns out, that rule also ends up pushing this industry towards minimizing its total cost of production by funneling business towards those firms that have lower costs. To see why, let's think about it this way. So if you've got a market with competitive firms and there's n number of firms, it must be true that the price, which as you remember is a marginal revenue, so for instance if we're a wheat farmer, our $5 bushel of wheat that we would show up, and that's the going price in the market, that's our marginal revenue. That's also determined by the market price. So the market price ends up being the marginal revenue. We have no control over it, so we take the market price as the amount that we would get in extra revenue for every extra bushel we sell. So that price equals the marginal cost of firm 1, right? If each firm is following the maxim of profit maximization, which is choose the quantity where MR or P equals MC, then that first firm chooses here. The second firm also chooses to produce where price equals its marginal cost, all the way down to the last firm, firm N. His or her marginal cost will also equal the price or marginal revenue if he or she is truly searching after profit. So the question is, what happens if firms don't have identical marginal costs? And of course this is true. Not all firms will have exactly the same cost. For Saudi Arabia to produce oil, much cheaper per barrel than the US. So marginal cost is going to be different between firms. So what do we do with that information? Well, let's go straight to an application. So we take a look at two different firms here. You can see Farm 2 has a different lower marginal cost than Farm 1. This could be for any number of reasons. Perhaps Farm 2 has a different style of technology. uses less labor or more labor. Something about their cost structure is different. So what do we do with that? The instinct, I think, for many people is to say, well, Farm 2's got lower costs. It should do most of the production for this market. However, if we take a look at price and just draw a price line, it can be anywhere. We see that at this price, let's say this is 5, firm 1 is going to produce where marginal cost, the green line, crosses marginal revenue or price, right? The orange line. And so they're going to produce some amount of corn. And Farm 2, same exact price, different cost structure. It is true they're going to produce more than Farm 1, but not, it doesn't necessarily follow that because they are lower cost, they should and will produce all of the corn. So the answer to the question under the graph is no. In fact, the market will settle out to where each farm is producing that amount, that quantity that equates their price or marginal revenue with their own marginal cost curve. And if you're still skeptical, take a look at this proof. You do not need to by any means memorize this graph. It's basically just a proof, an explanation, or support for the argument just made. And that is, look, it's not ideal or even realistic to expect that the lower cost firm will produce all of the product in a market. In fact, we're making the argument here that if Farm 2 were producing all 200 units of corn for this market and Farm 1 were producing 0, that would not be ideal. So we could in fact improve the system by lowering costs if we asked Farm 2 to produce a little bit less. So going from 200 to 197, for instance, this is the part that you don't need to memorize, that does drop the cost, the area under the marginal cost curve, for the number of units it's reducing, is that area A. So we reduce cost by the amount of area A. Meanwhile, Farm 1 picks up those 3 units that Farm 2 is not doing, and lo and behold, that does increase costs, right? Because Farm 1's got its own costs, but that increases the area B, which is much smaller than area A. So put those two effects together, by moving production from Farm 2 to Farm 1, we've cut cost by A and increased cost by B. On net, that's a savings. And the thing that makes free market capitalism such a powerful philosophy is that it happens without anybody planning it and anybody enforcing it. So your authors argue invisible hand property 1, even though no actor in a market economy intends to do so, in this free market, where this condition tends to hold, we're going to get total costs minimized. And that's a good thing. Because after all, society does not have unlimited resources. So let's return to an idea we've looked at before, and that is, all right, so what happens when profits do erupt in certain industries? Well, because of one of our original assumptions about human motivation is self-interest, we can trust all the players in the market, both consumers and sellers, to abide by the rule that they will respond to any incentive that improves their self-interest. So if profits show up in a new place, we can expect sellers who are looking to make profit, who are looking to earn income for their own families, to seek those out and to enter those industries. And the magic thing is, as they each seek out their sort of greener grass on the other side of the fence, and move to those newly profitable industries, that will increase the supply in those industries and pull down the profit. And if you'd like a little proof of that, here's a little supply and demand graph. As new entrants come into a market, supply increases, and that's going to pull down price. Price started out here, price is going to end up here. New firms come in, that's going to push down the price, other things equal, in that industry, and that's part of the reason why profits erode in industries where there's brand new competitors coming in to chase the profit. All right, and if you really want to geek out on this, think about the implications. Through no centralized planning, through only the sheer trust in self-interest as a powerful motivator, you've got society organizing its limited resources. The sellers and are the ones controlling these limited resources in production, moving them, shuffling them around towards where they're most profitable, right? So moving away from less profitable towards more profitable. The idea here is that it optimally balances, but optimally balances production. But where the thing is, where the profit happens is exactly where society wants it to happen, right? New industries that develop new amounts of profitability only do so because probably there's some huge increase in demand. There's some reason for the profitability to be there. So in a sense, the signal of profit just tells you where society wants energy and production to go. You may have heard of the term creative destruction. This comes from an economist named Joseph Schumpeter. The idea is that same one that we just mentioned, where profits encourage new entrants to come in and basically try to destroy the profitability of the existing incumbent firms. And since no one really profits from doing the same thing over and over again, especially in industries where new entrants can come and go at will, you've got to innovate to protect those above normal profits. And those who fail to innovate will be displaced by those who do innovate. And that's the process of creative destruction. It is destructive, but it's also incredibly creative and responsible for a lot of the economic growth we've seen in the 20th and 21st centuries. Now, it's time for a little bit of a disclaimer, especially considering the chapters we're about to hit after this. This magic, powerful, efficient force of the invisible hand is not going to work everywhere. It only works under certain circumstances. For instance, in very competitive types of markets. Not all markets are this competitive. Many of them are not. There needs to be accurate information available to both sides, both buyers and sellers. There can be no externalities. We've already seen how externalities can create market failures by failing to account for some of the costs or benefits of a transaction. And there needs to be no oligopoly or monopoly, no large, powerful firms. And if either of those conditions are violated, in other words, if we do have imperfect information or we do have imperfect competition, then the invisible hand does not work as well. Capitalism simply does not work quite as well. All right. So what do you do with this kind of information? Here's a question. Think about it for a minute. And if you answered C, you would agree with Joseph Schumpeter. You would agree with the thrust of this chapter. You'd innovate, find new ways of producing output. That's the very nature of creative destruction. A is not a bad answer. But the assumption here is that we were talking about a competitive industry, so probably the firm does not have the ability to try a technique like A. But when we start moving into oligopoly and monopoly, where you have maybe, instead of a lot of small firms, 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 large firms, you better believe they are going to try A all over the place. Could be simply put, it's better not to have to compete with other firms. So lots of ways you can sort of create barriers to entry, and that's what we'll expect to see firms try to do if they can. These firms cannot do that. They also cannot raise prices to earn more revenue. Remember, they have no control over market price. They're just such a little guy in the giant market. They're not going to be able to influence price. And they're also not going to be large enough to force their suppliers to do anything. They're not Walmart asking for and expecting their suppliers to jump when they say jump. And your final application question and final slide. Take a look at it. Pause if you want to think about it. And the answer is all of the above. All right. See you in class.